This is my first CABW meeting, so thank you for having me. So I'm Ted Grantham with the UC Berkeley Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, and also with UC ANR as a Cooperative Extension Specialist. Today, I think I'm going to provide you with an approach that, a modeling approach to evaluate flow alteration in rivers. I think we'll build on some of the stuff you heard earlier, probably from Jason Mann. I wasn't here this morning, but I'm fairly familiar with that work. But this is work we've been doing at the national scale, so I think, we'll to provide a broader perspective, and definitely want to acknowledge these collaborators, particularly Darren Carlisle, who's been leading a lot of this work. We've heard a lot about environmental flows today. This is the definition given by the Brisbane Convention, and really the sort of the crux of this from a scientific perspective, as we've also heard, is trying to understand how changes in flow or particular flow metrics correspond to changes in ecological conditions. And Rocky did a really nice job setting this up and describing some of the challenges of quantifying this delta H, or this change in flow regimes. This is something that is challenging for a whole host of reasons. At least a major issue is the lack of flow data that we have across the United States, and generally we have relatively few gauges where we have biological data that we hope to associate with those flow. And then, of course, many of our rivers are also highly altered, and so we don't actually know what the natural flow regime should be to understand how changes in flow may be affecting the ecosystem. And so to really get around this issue, we rely on models to help address this. And we use models in this kind of environmental flow context in a variety of ways, some of which you've already heard about today, including stream classification, predicting natural flows at ungauged sites, assessing flow alteration, and then ultimately establishing these standards. And I'm going to focus specifically on sort of that item 3 today. How do we use these models to assess flow alteration? And the approach is one that you've, I think, already heard about a little bit, which is a statistical modeling approach. So this is sort of in contrast to the more physical or deterministic modeling approaches, such as used by Rafi. And in particular, this is called random forest is the statistical approach. And it's it's a black box model, and by that I mean you're just basically putting various predictor variables or drivers into this statistical model and trying to get the best prediction of some stream flow attribute that you can without any underlying assumptions about the processes or interactions among those variables that ultimately yield that stream flow. So how do we actually assess flow alteration using this approach? So it's really a two-step process. I'm going to walk you through each of these. So the first, we develop these series of natural or unimpaired flow metrics using these modeling approaches. And then second, we then apply these trained models that are able to predict flows from natural basin features to gauge sites where we suspect there's been flow alteration. And we can compare then our model predictions with our observations at those sites to evaluate deviation from natural expectations. So this first step, we first just develop these underlying baseline metrics. And to do this, we rely on our network of USGS stream gauges. These are about a little over 1,000 gauges from across the nation with a long-term record, and these are considered reference quality gauges. In other words, these are gauges with very limited human influence in their watershed upstream. And so we have these 1,200 reference quality sites across the nation. In this case, we've heard a lot about different metrics used to examine different stream properties and potential ecologically important attributes of the flow regime. We went through the exercise of actually kind of scouring the literature to identify as many metrics you conceivably could calculate from daily flow records, and just and tried this approach with every single metric we possibly could calculate calculate, just to be exhaustive. And we used, this modeling approach allows you to use a number of different sort of readily available geospatial predictors, and these include things like climate, so precipitation and temperature, soils topography, and we use this random forest modeling approach as I mentioned. And the way the sort of the overall approach works, just kind of schematically, we have a reference. Here's a single reference basin where we have a downstream flow gauge, right, where we have these observed records of daily flows. And from these GIS or geospatial data sets, we can characterize the catchment conditions, the natural underlying topographic, soil, and geologic properties of that catchment. And we can do this for thousands of reference sites across the nation where we have both information on catchment characteristics and these observed flows. And we exclude some of these catchments for model validation, which I'll describe in a moment. So we pull all this information from these records, and we do this for each individual flow metric that we consider, and then we apply this modeling framework to relate these catchment characteristics as predictors to our observed flows, and train the models to try to do the best job it can to predict that particular metric. Once we have those trained metrics, we can then go to our reserve sites. These are the sites that we reserve for model validation, take those same predictors and use the model to make a prediction of what the flow should be based on those catchment characteristics. And we then can compare our observed flows from those sites with our prediction and evaluate performance. In other words, our ability to predict flows with that set of predictors. And so we do this 600 times for each individual metric we're trying to predict. And if these models perform well, this is sort of the distribution that you get. So this O to E value basically represents the observed value of the metric relative to your expected or predicted value. And if the model is doing well, you're going to get a value of 1 in a fairly tight distribution when you look at all of your sites, right? So that would be a metric that we do a good job of predicting. However, we're probably going to have some metrics where this set of catchment characteristics actually don't do a very good job of explaining a particular attribute of the flow regime, and in which case we're going to have a much wider distribution of these O to E values and potentially some biases as well. So we did this for, as I mentioned, about 600 metrics, and then evaluated the performance of these metrics across these various kind of traditional model performance criteria, and I can walk you through this. And before I do that, let me just explain to you the sort of distinction between popular metrics and new metrics. So there's sort of a set of sort of almost canonical metrics that are used commonly in environmental flow applications. So these include the indicators of hydrologic alteration, or 33 metrics that are used that describe the magnitude, timing, duration, frequency of flows. There's also another 170 metrics that have been proposed by Hendrickson in the HIT software package. So for those of you that regularly engage with hydrologic metrics, those are the ones that are almost always used in environmental flow applications around, certainly in the United States. And so we specifically kind of called out those metrics that are commonly used, and then added all these additional metrics from more obscure areas of the literature, including a lot from the hydrology literature. And so these distributions here just kind of show you differentiate those sort of common popular metrics from these new metrics. And the Nash Sutcliffe efficiency, or NSE, is basically just like think about it, it's similar to R squared in that it values closer to 1 indicate really good model performance. In other words, where our predictions are very similar to our observations. And we get about a quarter of our metrics end up in this high value. We have pretty good performance in terms of bias for most of our metrics. metrics, about 2/3 of them have pretty close relationships in terms of the mean observed versus expected value, and this is our example for the standard deviation of those metrics. So this is just sort of collectively looking at that sort of domain of all the metrics that, again, describe different attributes of the flow regime. And I won't go into all the details of what properties they actually are, but just to say that, first of all, many of these popular metrics, it turns out, are not reliably predicted by these catchment characteristics, particularly those representing low flows. And this is actually common to what we found in other studies. And generally, no matter what type of hydrologic modeling approach you're using, low flows in particular tend to be very difficult to predict, which is obviously problematic for much of a lot of our ecological studies, where low flows are really the critical period of time for many of these species. And we did find, however, that for most dimensions of the flow regime are represented by at least one predictable metric. And by what I mean by this is we describe these general dimensions of the flow regime, magnitudes, frequency, duration, so forth, and while some of the common metrics turned out to not be predictable, we actually did find some new metrics that did represent those aspects of the flow regime. So that was somewhat encouraging. And I would just argue that in general, this idea of predictability should be incorporated in how we select and determine which metrics we actually end up using in our studies. So moving on to step 2. So now we have these models that are capable of predicting unimpaired natural flow metrics across all of these different dimensions of the flow regime. And so now we can take these models and actually apply them to our entire gauging networks, including the 3,800 plus other gauges that are considered non-reference that we didn't use for model training. And so the basic approach here is we start with the same underlying model for predicting unimpaired flows, and now we have our set of altered sites. And we can use the same model, we can derive the same underlying physical properties of those catchments and run them through our model to get some prediction of unimpaired flow based on the natural underlying basin characteristics at those gauges. And then we can calculate those metrics from our observed record, and then calculate this O to E value. So again, this is the deviation, or the value of the observed metric relative to this predicted value. And so, as I mentioned earlier, not all of these metrics are highly predictable. However, there's error in that. So we want to account for that when determining whether or not we want to consider flow to be altered or not. And the way we do that is we can basically define the bounds of error around our natural or our reference sites, shown in the green distribution. And then in the red distribution here is the ODE values for our altered sites. And when our values exceed some threshold, in this case I use the 90th and 10th percentile values, we can say with some confidence that those sites that have values above that threshold are in fact inflated or depleted. So that makes sense. So basically we use the information we get from our model in terms of its performance and this range of variability among reference sites, and we can say, well, when we can say with some certainty that sites are showing values that exceed these natural bounds of variation. And so we can also do this with metrics that we do a less well job predicting. We have much broader bounds of detectability in a sense, but when we do see sites outside of that range, we can still say with some confidence that we have evidence of, in this case, flow depletion or flow inflation. So in this case, we did this we're doing this at a national scale, and because we wanted to sort of start to make this, kind of take this unwieldy set of metrics and sort of provide a more coherent description of what's going on, we decided to focus on these various attributes. And I'll just give you one example of high flows. And so these are two different metrics that express high flows. This is the median annual maximum flow and the specific mean annual max flow. That just means the max flow divided by drainage area. And so at the national scale, these bars represent the proportion of sites that had evidence of alteration. And so in this case, we saw that 30% of the sites at the national scale that we evaluated had evidence of max flow depletion. The ones in blue showed inflation, and then the bars in gray are indeterminate. And so those are sites that may have inflation and depletion, but they're not within those bounds of sort of detectability in terms of impact. So generally speaking, we see a high proportion of sites showing a depletion of maximum flows, and these patterns also show up at the regional scale. So we're doing this analysis at the national scale and then dividing the nation in different regions to understand sort of interregional differences in these patterns of flow alteration. So we can also, because these metrics are evaluated individual sites, we can also map the patterns of alteration for individual metrics. And so here I'm showing this specific mean max annual flow metric. So again, just mean max annual flow divided by drainage area for the western mountain region of the US. And so the dots in red represent highly depleted flows, so where max flows are less than 20% of their expected value. The lighter reds are less than 55%. The grays are indeterminate, and then the blues are inflated. And so what you can see, consistent with what I just showed you before, we see a lot of sites that have depleted max flows, perhaps some regional clustering, but surprisingly, there are also a lot of these inflated sites also kind of interspersed among the majority of sites that are either tend to be depleted. So to sort of make sense of this, I looked into a few of these sites in the Sierra Nevada region to try to figure out what was going on, if this was some weird artifact of the data, or if there might be sort of a plausible explanation for it. And it turns out that in this site, for example, where we had evidence of max flow inflation, when you look into the data and the NHD layers, for example, you can actually see that the sites that showed evidence of inflation receive water from interbasin transfers, right? So the story kind of makes sense in that case. So, and I suspect that's probably what's going on for a lot of the other sites throughout the West that we see as well. That need to look a little more into that. So there's a lot of information to sort of unpack with that analysis, and we're still sort of busy trying to figure out a way to do that. But just a few sort of just initial findings, at least. So of those altered gauges that or non-reference gauges that we evaluated, we found that the vast majority of them are modified for multiple metrics, which was somewhat surprising. And perhaps less surprising is that the metrics that represented high flows and flow variability tended to be depleted, and measures of low flows tended to be inflated. So those were fairly consistent findings across the nation. But as I showed with the high flow example, there often are exceptions. That may require some kind of deeper digging to explain. And just on a preliminary level, at least, we see that we do see really unique patterns of flow alteration, or unique combinations of flow alteration metrics among the different regions. And sort of working to find out, we're still kind of figuring out how the best way to explain that in a sort of a coherent way as well. So just to kind of wrap this up, there's evidence of widespread alteration to multiple aspects of the flow regimes. And these types of modeling and impacts assessment, I think, can help inform the targeted management of ecologically relevant metrics. A companion sort of study that we're doing with this is actually trying to relate these flow alteration indicators to indicators of ecological health, but didn't have time to cover that today. But just sort of to conceptualize, I think what sort of a promising approach forward is to kind of consider some of these attributes of flow metrics in terms of their predictability and their ecological relevance, and of course their relevance to management, and how well can we actually, do we even have the ability to tweak some of these metrics in a feasible way? And I think that sort of collectively these pieces of the pie can help us guide the way that we use these metrics in environmental flow studies. And with that, I think that's it. So I'll take maybe a question if there's time. Thanks.